Some people left this world with one final prediction and got it right. Fact 1. Mark Twain knew his exit would follow Halley's Comet. Mark Twain spent much of his life turning observations into unforgettable quotes, but one of his most remarkable statements wasn't a joke. He was born in 1835, shortly after Halley's Comet appeared in the sky. Decades later, Twain casually remarked that he had arrived with the comet and expected to leave with it as well. At the time, it sounded like one of those clever comments famous writers make when they want to sound dramatic. Yet, as Halley's Comet approached Earth again in 1910, Twain's health began to decline. On April 20th, just one day after the comet reached its closest point to Earth, he died. The timing stunned people around the world. Twain had not predicted the exact date, but he had accurately linked his life to one of the most famous celestial events in history. For a man known for writing fiction, this ended up being one of his strangest true stories. Fact 2. Abraham Lincoln described a presidential funeral days before his death. Only a few days before he was assassinated, Abraham Lincoln shared a disturbing dream with friends and members of his cabinet. In the dream, he walked through the White House and noticed people crying. He eventually reached a room where a body lay surrounded by soldiers. Lincoln asked who had died. A guard replied that it was the president, killed by an assassin. The story deeply unsettled those who heard it, but nobody imagined how soon it would become reality. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. That night, John Wilkes Booth shot him. He died the following morning. After the assassination, people remembered Lincoln's account of the dream and could hardly believe the similarities. Historians still debate whether it was a coincidence, subconscious anxiety, or something more mysterious. Either way, Lincoln unknowingly described circumstances eerily close to the tragedy that soon followed. Fact 3. Arnold Schwarzenegger's friend joked about cheating death one last time. Austrian bodybuilder and actor Andreas Münzer became famous for achieving an extremely lean physique that many believed pushed the limits of human endurance. Throughout the 1990s, friends, doctors, and fellow athletes warned him that his health appeared to be deteriorating. Münzer often brushed off concerns and reportedly joked that if his lifestyle killed him, at least he would die looking the way he wanted. As competitions continued, his body suffered severe internal damage. In 1996, he was rushed to a hospital with multiple organ complications. Surgeons discovered extensive internal problems linked to years of extreme physical stress. Despite efforts to save him, he died at just 31 years old. What made the story so haunting was how often he had dismissed warnings and casually spoken about the possibility of dying young. His comments were never intended as a serious prediction, yet they ended up sounding like an unsettling preview of his own fate. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. We're curious to see how far our videos travel around the world. Fact 4. Titanic victim. William Thomas Stead predicted a disaster. Strikingly similar to his own years before the Titanic ever left port, British journalist William Thomas Stead wrote stories that seemed eerily connected to his future. In one article, he described a large passenger ship sinking after colliding with another vessel because there were not enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. In another work, he imagined a major transatlantic disaster involving a ship and significant loss of life at sea. At the time, readers viewed these stories as commentary on maritime safety rather than prophecy. Then came April of 1912. Stead boarded the Titanic as a first-class passenger during its maiden voyage. When the ship struck an iceberg and began sinking in the North Atlantic, many remembered his earlier writings. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Stead perished alongside more than 1,500 others, becoming part of a tragedy he had described years before it happened. Fact 5. John Seddon spoke about his own funeral just days before dying. John Seddon served as Prime Minister of New Zealand and was known for his larger-than-life personality. During a trip to Australia in 1906, he reportedly joked with companions about how people would react if he died unexpectedly. Seddon was in good spirits and actively discussing future plans, making the comment seem like harmless conversation. Yet several witnesses later recalled how strangely specific some of his remarks sounded after events unfolded. While returning home aboard a ship crossing the Tasman Sea, Seddon suffered a massive heart attack. Despite efforts to help him, he died before reaching New Zealand. The nation was stunned. Newspapers soon revisited the comments he had made only days earlier. What had seemed like casual speculation suddenly felt unsettling. Sometimes people make passing observations about death, only for history to transform those remarks into something that sounds far more prophetic. Fact 6. Jeane Dixon warned of a presidential assassination. Years before it happened. Few people became as famous for predictions as Jeane Dixon. During the 1950s, she publicly stated that a Democratic president elected in 1960 would die in office. At the time, the prediction seemed bold but vague enough to dismiss. Then John F. Kennedy won the election in 1960. 3 years later, he was assassinated in Dallas, shocking the world. The prediction instantly became one of the most discussed examples of apparent foresight in modern history. What makes the story especially fascinating is that Dixon repeated variations of the warning long before Kennedy's presidency began. Critics argue that many of her other predictions failed, while supporters point to this one as evidence of extraordinary intuition. Regardless of where people stand, the timing remains remarkable. A warning issued years earlier appeared to align with one of the most tragic and defining events of 20th century American history. Fact 7. Terry Kath made a deadly joke. Moments before pulling the trigger. Terry Kath, the gifted guitarist and founding member of the band Chicago, was admired for his musical talent and fearless personality. In January of 1978, he was spending time with friends while handling several firearms. According to witnesses, Kath removed the magazine from a pistol and repeatedly reassured everyone that the gun could not fire. He reportedly joked around, pointed the weapon toward himself, and emphasized that there was no danger. What he did not realize was that a live round remained in the chamber. Moments later, he pulled the trigger. The gun discharged instantly, fatally wounding him. Friends were left in shock because the tragedy occurred immediately after Kath had confidently insisted the weapon was harmless. His final comments were not intended as a prediction, yet they became one of the most chilling examples of someone unknowingly speaking directly before a fatal mistake changed everything. Fact 8. Pete Maravich said he never wanted to live long, then died. Exactly as he feared basketball legend. Pete Maravich spent years dazzling fans with creativity that seemed decades ahead of its time. Yet one interview from the 1970s would later haunt sports fans. Maravich spoke openly about life, health, and mortality, saying he did not want to play professional basketball for many years only to die young from a heart attack. The comment seemed hypothetical, the kind of reflection athletes sometimes make while discussing the pressures of competition. What nobody knew was that Maravich had been born with a rare heart defect that had gone undetected for much of his life. In January of 1988, while playing a casual pickup basketball game, he suddenly collapsed. Doctors determined he had suffered heart failure. He was only 40 years old. Decades after the interview, people revisited his words and were stunned by how closely they matched the circumstances of his death. Fact 9. Johnny Ace played a deadly game of Russian roulette. During a Christmas break in the early 1950s, rhythm and blues star Johnny Ace was one of the fastest rising performers in America. On Christmas Day of 1954, he was backstage between performances in Houston, Texas, relaxing with friends and fellow musicians. According to witnesses, Ace had been handling a revolver and jokingly playing a version of Russian roulette. Several people reportedly warned him to stop, but he remained convinced there was no real danger. At one point, he allegedly told those around him not to worry because nothing would happen. Moments later, he placed the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. This time, the chamber contained a live round. The young singer died almost instantly at only 25 years old. Fans across the country were stunned. What makes the story so haunting is how confidently he dismissed the risk only moments before fate proved otherwise. Fact 10. Thomas Andrews warned about the Titanic's flaws before sailing on it. Thomas Andrews was not just a passenger aboard the Titanic. He was the ship's chief designer and knew every detail of the vessel better than almost anyone alive. Before the ship's maiden voyage, Andrews had expressed concerns about safety features, particularly the number of lifeboats carried on board. Like several other experts, he believed additional precautions would make the ship safer in a major emergency. Although he remained proud of the ship's engineering, he understood that no vessel was truly unsinkable. When Titanic struck an iceberg in April of 1912, Andrews quickly assessed the damage and reportedly realized the ship was doomed. He spent his final hours helping passengers reach lifeboats and encouraging others to save themselves. Andrews died when the ship sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean. In a tragic twist, many of the dangers he had worried about before departure became central factors in one of history's deadliest maritime disasters. Fact 11. Jimi Hendrix spoke of not expecting to grow. Old Jimi Hendrix transformed modern music during a career that lasted only a few years but changed rock history forever. Friends and interviewers often noticed that Hendrix seemed unusually aware of his own mortality. On several occasions, he suggested that he did not expect to live a long life. Those comments were not framed as supernatural predictions. Instead, they reflected the intense pace of fame, touring, and personal struggles that surrounded him. Still, many people remembered those remarks after September of 1970. Hendrix was staying in London when he died at just 27 years old, following complications related to barbiturate use. His death shocked fans worldwide and helped cement the tragic pattern, later known as the 27 Club. Looking back, listeners found it difficult to ignore how often Hendrix had hinted that his future might be shorter than most people imagined, even while standing at the height of global success. Fact 12. Richard Feynman's last letter sounded like a farewell to life. Richard Feynman was one of the passengers aboard the Titanic during its famous maiden voyage. Before the ship departed, he wrote a letter describing the vessel and the excitement surrounding the journey. In that correspondence, he mentioned strange feelings about the trip and noted that he would not be surprised if unexpected trouble occurred. The comments were not dramatic enough to attract attention at the time, but they gained significance after the disaster unfolded. When Titanic struck the iceberg and began sinking, Feynman became one of the more than 1,500 people who never returned home. His letter later surfaced and was studied by historians, fascinated by apparent premonitions connected to the tragedy. Whether his words reflected intuition, anxiety, or coincidence remains unknown. What is certain is that a seemingly ordinary message written before departure ended up sounding remarkably like a farewell from someone unknowingly approaching his final days. Fact 13. Bud Dwyer announced. There would be no prison cell in his future. Pennsylvania State Treasurer Bud Dwyer faced serious corruption charges during the 1980s and maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. After being convicted, he scheduled a press conference that many expected would be a final public statement before sentencing. In the days leading up to the event, Dwyer made comments suggesting that people would soon understand his decision and that he would not spend years behind bars. Reporters interpreted the remarks in different ways, assuming he might reveal new evidence or announce an appeal. Instead, on January 22, 1987, Dwyer addressed journalists gathered in the room. Near the end of the conference, he unexpectedly produced a handgun. Despite attempts by those present to stop him, he took his own life in front of cameras. His earlier statements suddenly carried a chilling new meaning. What seemed cryptic beforehand became tragically clear only moments later. Fact 14. Jack Daniel predicted a small problem that ended his life. Jack Daniel built one of the most famous whiskey brands in American history, but his death came from something surprisingly ordinary. One morning in the early 1900s, Daniel arrived at work and became frustrated when he could not remember the combination to his office safe. According to the widely repeated account, he kicked the safe in anger. The impact injured one of his toes, creating a wound that later became infected. At first, the injury seemed minor, but Daniel reportedly complained that it was causing him increasing trouble. Over time, the infection worsened dramatically. In an era before modern antibiotics, even small injuries could become life-threatening. Eventually, complications from the infection led to his death in 1911. The story remains famous because Daniel supposedly realized almost immediately that kicking the safe had been a terrible mistake. A brief moment of frustration ultimately triggered the chain of events that ended the life of a business legend. Fact 15. Robert Williams warned about robots replacing humans before becoming the first known person killed by one. In the late 20th century, factories across America were rapidly introducing automation. Many workers worried that machines were becoming increasingly powerful and difficult to control. Robert Williams worked at a Ford manufacturing plant in Michigan and often dealt directly with automated equipment. Colleagues later recalled conversations about the growing role of machines in industrial workplaces. In January of 1979, Williams entered a storage area where robotic equipment was operating. A robotic arm malfunctioned and struck him, causing fatal injuries. The tragedy made headlines because Williams became the first documented person known to have been killed by an industrial robot. Afterward, co-workers remembered concerns that automation was advancing faster than workplace safety measures. While he never predicted the exact circumstances, his worries about increasingly complex machines suddenly seemed chillingly relevant. The event became a landmark case in industrial safety and a warning about the risk that can accompany technological progress. Fact 16. Hunter S. Thompson planned his own farewell years before it happened. Journalist Hunter S. Thompson spent decades building a reputation as one of America's most unconventional writers. Unlike many people who avoided discussing death, Thompson spoke openly about it. Friends and family frequently heard him describe exactly how he wanted his life to end and what kind of memorial he envisioned. He disliked the idea of a prolonged decline and often said he wanted to leave on his own terms. In 2005, Thompson died at his Colorado home. What stunned many people was how closely reality followed plans he had discussed for years. Even his funeral reflected ideas he had outlined long before his death. His ashes were famously launched from a towering cannon-shaped structure designed according to his wishes. Looking back, loved ones realized that Thompson had spent years describing not only how he wanted to be remembered, but also the circumstances surrounding his final chapter. Fact 17. Richard Faden predicted trouble on Mount Everest before the mountain took his life. Mount Everest has always attracted climbers willing to accept extraordinary risks. Richard Faden was among those determined adventurers. Before one expedition, he reportedly spoke candidly about the dangers of extreme altitude and unpredictable weather. Unlike many climbers who focused only on success, Faden openly acknowledged that Everest could easily become his final destination. Friends later remembered conversations in which he discussed the possibility with unusual calmness. During his ascent, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Severe weather and the brutal environment high on the mountain created life-threatening challenges for everyone involved. Faden ultimately died during the expedition, becoming one of many climbers claimed by Everest over the decades. What made his story especially haunting was not reckless bravado, but acceptance. He understood exactly what the mountain was capable of. His words were not a prophecy in the supernatural sense, yet they reflected a clear awareness of the danger that would eventually overtake him. Fact 18. Owen Hart joked about the stunt that would become his final performance professional wrestler. Owen Hart was known backstage for his sense of humor and practical jokes. In 1999, he was preparing for an elaborate entrance during a live wrestling event in Kansas City. The stunt involved lowering him from the arena rafters using specialized equipment. Several people later recalled conversations about how complicated and risky the setup appeared. Hart reportedly joked about the situation in the relaxed manner performers often use to deal with stressful circumstances. As thousands of fans watched inside the arena, a catastrophic equipment failure occurred during the descent. Hart fell from a great height into the ring and suffered fatal injuries. The shocking accident was witnessed by a live audience and immediately became one of the most tragic moments in sports entertainment history. In the aftermath, many remembered his earlier comments and jokes about the stunt, which suddenly seemed heartbreaking given the events that followed. Fact 19. Rocky Marciano's last phone call sounded like a goodbye. Former heavyweight boxing champion Rocky Marciano retired undefeated, a feat still unmatched among heavyweight champions. In August of 1969, he boarded a small private airplane on the eve of his 46th birthday. Weather conditions were poor, and several people advised against flying. Before departure, Marciano made calls to friends and family that later gained unusual significance. Some relatives recalled that he seemed reflective and spoke more emotionally than usual. Nothing he said explicitly predicted death, but there was a tone that people could not forget afterward. During the flight, the aircraft encountered difficulties and crashed in Iowa. Marciano and the others on board were killed. In the aftermath, those final conversations were replayed repeatedly by loved ones searching for meaning. Sometimes a prediction is not a dramatic statement, but a feeling. For many who knew Marciano, his final words carried an unexpected weight that only became clear after tragedy struck. Fact 20. Aeronautics pioneer. Otto Lilienthal warned that sacrifices would be necessary. Long before the Wright brothers achieved powered flight, German aviation pioneer Otto Lilienthal was conducting daring glider experiments. He completed thousands of successful flights and became one of the most respected figures in early aviation. Yet Lilienthal understood better than anyone how dangerous his work truly was. He often spoke about the risks involved and famously remarked that sacrifices would have to be made if humanity hoped to conquer the skies. Those words sounded philosophical at the time, reflecting the mindset of an inventor pushing boundaries. In August of 1896, one of his gliders suddenly stalled during flight. Lilienthal fell from a significant height and suffered severe injuries. Before dying the next day, he reportedly remained calm despite the situation. Afterward, many remembered his statement about sacrifice. It was not a prediction of the exact accident, but it became one of history's most haunting examples of someone accurately describing the cost of their life's mission. Fact 21. Spencer Perceval dreamed of his assassination before it happened. Spencer Perceval holds a unique place in British history as the only Prime Minister of the United Kingdom ever assassinated. In the weeks leading up to his death in 1812, Perceval reportedly shared an unsettling dream with members of his family. According to accounts preserved afterward, he dreamed that he was entering a government building when he was confronted and shot by an unknown attacker. The dream disturbed him enough that he discussed it openly. Family members listened, but treated it as nothing more than a nightmare. Then, on May 11, 1812, Perceval entered the lobby of the House of Commons. There, a disgruntled merchant named John Bellingham stepped forward and shot him. The Prime Minister died shortly afterward. News of the assassination spread rapidly, but so did stories about the dream. For many people, the similarities were impossible to ignore, making Perceval's experience one of the most famous alleged premonitions in political history. Fact 22. Tupac Shakur spoke repeatedly about dying young. Few artists discussed mortality as openly as Tupac Shakur. Throughout interviews, lyrics, and conversations with friends, he frequently reflected on the possibility that he might not live to old age. Growing up surrounded by violence and later becoming one of the most recognizable figures in hip-hop, Tupac often described feeling that his future could be cut short. What makes the story remarkable is how consistently he returned to that subject. Years before his death, he recorded songs exploring his own funeral, legacy, and the idea of leaving the world unexpectedly. Some listeners viewed it as artistic expression. Others believed he genuinely sensed danger around him. In September of 1996, after attending a boxing match in Las Vegas, Tupac was shot while riding in a car. He died 6 days later. Following the tragedy, fans revisited countless interviews and lyrics, stunned by how often he had seemingly anticipated an early ending. Fact 23. William T. Stead ignored warnings about a voyage he once imagined years before boarding the Titanic. Journalist William Thomas Stead had already earned attention for writing fictional stories involving catastrophic shipwrecks in the Atlantic. Those stories emphasized inadequate lifeboats and the deadly consequences of overconfidence at sea. By 1912, Stead was internationally famous and preparing to travel aboard the Titanic. Friends reportedly expressed concerns about ocean travel, particularly because of his previous writings. Stead himself remained calm and did not allow those concerns to influence his plans. When the ship struck an iceberg on April 14th, reality began resembling fiction in an almost unbelievable way. Witnesses later described Stead helping passengers remain calm as evacuation efforts unfolded. He ultimately died when the ship sank. Historians continue to cite his case as one of the strangest examples of apparent foreshadowing ever recorded. The man who had imagined maritime disaster in print eventually became part of one of history's most infamous maritime tragedies. Fact 24. John Lennon spoke about not expecting a long life. As one of the most famous musicians on Earth, John Lennon spent years under extraordinary public attention. During various interviews, Lennon occasionally reflected on fame, danger, and mortality. He once suggested that he could envision dying at the hands of a fanatic, rather than in some dramatic political event or military conflict. The comment attracted little attention at the time because celebrities often discuss the pressures of fame. However, the statement took on a chilling significance years later. On December 8, 1980, Lennon returned to his New York apartment building after a recording session. Waiting nearby was Mark David Chapman, a Disturbed fan who had earlier obtained Lennon's autograph. That evening, Chapman shot and killed him. The murder shocked the world and generated enormous media coverage. In retrospect, Lennon's earlier remarks seemed disturbingly accurate, as if he had somehow recognized one of the greatest risks that came with being a global icon. Fact 25. Bob Marley once said, "The thing that kills him would be inside him." Bob Marley spent much of his life spreading messages of hope, unity, and resilience. Yet during the final years of his life, he occasionally spoke in surprisingly reflective terms about mortality. After suffering a foot injury that led doctors to discover a rare form of melanoma, Marley resisted some recommended treatments because of personal beliefs and his demanding schedule. Friends later recalled conversations in which he suggested that if death came for him, it would not be through violence or an accident, but from something already growing within. At the time, those remarks sounded philosophical rather than prophetic. As the disease spread throughout his body, his condition steadily worsened despite efforts to continue performing and recording music. In May of 1981, Marley died at only 36 years old. Looking back, many were struck by how closely his comments mirrored reality. The danger he described had indeed been inside him all along. Fact 26. Gus Grissom joked about the risks of spaceflight before a deadly test Virgil. Gus Grissom was one of NASA's most experienced astronauts and one of the pioneers of America's space program. He understood the dangers of exploration better than almost anyone alive. During the 1960s, Grissom occasionally joked about the possibility of dying in pursuit of space travel, noting that astronauts accepted risks few others would willingly face. Friends and colleagues remembered his practical attitude toward danger. On January 27, 1967, Grissom and fellow astronauts Ed White and Roger Chaffee participated in a launch rehearsal for the Apollo program. What was expected to be a routine ground test turned catastrophic when a fire erupted inside the spacecraft cabin. The crew had no opportunity to escape. All three men died within minutes. The tragedy shocked the nation and transformed NASA's safety procedures. Grissom's earlier remarks about accepting the possibility of death suddenly carried an entirely different meaning after the disaster. Fact 27. John F. Kennedy made a chilling comment hours before Dallas. On the morning of November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was traveling through Texas during a political tour. At one point, conversation reportedly turned toward presidential security and the risks that came with public appearances. Kennedy acknowledged that if someone truly wanted to assassinate a president, preventing it would be extraordinarily difficult. According to accounts from those present, he specifically mentioned how a person with a high-powered rifle positioned in a building could carry out such an attack. The observation sounded like a realistic assessment of security challenges rather than a prediction. Only hours later, Kennedy's motorcade traveled through downtown Dallas. As the vehicles passed through Dealey Plaza, shots were fired from a nearby building. The president was mortally wounded and died later that day. After the assassination, witnesses remembered his earlier comments with disbelief. The scenario he had casually described appeared disturbingly similar to the tragedy that unfolded. Fact 28. Aileen Wuornos predicted she would return after death. Aileen Wuornos became one of the most notorious criminals in American history after being convicted of multiple murders in Florida. During interviews and legal proceedings leading up to her execution, she made numerous unusual statements about death and what she believed would happen afterward. Most were dismissed as bizarre remarks from a deeply troubled individual. However, one comment stood out. Wuornos repeatedly declared that she would return someday, comparing her expected return to a figure coming back after death. She spoke with remarkable certainty even during her final days. On October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Journalists covering the case noted that her final statements again referenced the idea of returning in the future. While there is nothing supernatural about the outcome, the confidence with which she spoke fascinated many observers. Her final words became one of the most discussed aspects of an already extraordinary and unsettling case. Fact 29. Ronnie Van Zant warned that he might not live past 30. Lynyrd Skynyrd frontman. Ronnie Van Zant possessed a reputation for confidence, charisma, and an unusual willingness to discuss mortality. Friends, bandmates, and family members later recalled that Van Zant often spoke about not expecting to live a long life. On several occasions, he reportedly said he doubted he would reach old age and suggested that he would rather leave behind a lasting legacy than grow old in the spotlight. Those comments seemed dramatic but not impossible for a young rock musician living an intense lifestyle. Then, in October of 1977, tragedy struck. While traveling between performances, the band's chartered aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed in Mississippi. Van Zant was killed at only 29 years old. In the years that followed, countless documentaries and interviews revisited his earlier remarks. Whether coincidence or intuition, his repeated statements about a short life became an unforgettable part of rock history. Fact 30. Sharon Tate told friends. She had a terrible feeling before her murder. In the summer of 1969, actress Sharon Tate was enjoying what should have been one of the happiest periods of her life. She was successful, widely admired, and expecting her first child. Yet according to several friends and acquaintances, Tate occasionally spoke about unsettling fears and recurring feelings that something terrible might happen to her. One story often repeated by those close to her involved an experience at her home where she claimed to have felt an overwhelming sense of dread. While she never described a specific prediction, people later remembered how seriously she seemed affected by those feelings. On August 9, 1969, members of the Manson family entered the home she was staying in and brutally murdered Tate and several others. The crime shocked America and became one of the most infamous murder cases of the 20th century. Her earlier fears afterwards seemed tragically difficult to ignore. Fact 31. Notorious B. IG recorded a song about his own funeral. Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G., built his career on vivid storytelling and brutally honest lyrics. Among his most remarkable recordings was a song titled Suicidal Thoughts, where he explored themes of death, mortality, and the possibility of his own funeral. As his fame grew, Wallace occasionally spoke about the dangers surrounding his lifestyle and the escalating tensions within the hip-hop world. Friends later recalled that he seemed increasingly aware that violence could eventually find him. In March of 1997, after attending an industry event in Los Angeles, Wallace was riding in a vehicle when another car pulled alongside and opened fire. He died shortly afterward at only 24 years old. Following the tragedy, fans revisited his music and interviews. Many were stunned by how often he had referenced dying young. His lyrics suddenly felt less like artistic imagination and more like an unsettling glimpse into his future. Fact 32. Johnny Cash dreamed of his wife calling him to the other side. After the death of his beloved wife June Carter Cash in 2003, Johnny Cash's health began to decline significantly. During his final months, he spoke openly about mortality and the possibility of being reunited with her. Friends and family members later recalled conversations in which Cash described vivid dreams involving June. In some of those dreams, she appeared peaceful and seemed to be waiting for him. Cash reportedly found comfort rather than fear in those experiences. Despite ongoing medical issues, he continued recording music and reflecting on life with unusual honesty. Only a few months after June's passing, Cash died in September of 2003. The closeness of the two deaths deeply moved fans around the world. Looking back, many remembered the stories about his dreams and his repeated comments about joining June again. Whether spiritual or symbolic, those remarks gained a powerful significance after his passing. Fact 33. Abraham de Moivre calculated his own death with math. Few stories blur the line between science and mystery quite like that of mathematician Abraham de Moivre. During the 18th century, de Moivre noticed a strange pattern in his health. According to accounts from the time, he observed that he seemed to require roughly 15 additional minutes of sleep each day. Fascinated by the trend, he began calculating where the pattern would eventually lead. His conclusion was astonishing. If the increase continued at the same rate, there would come a day when he would spend an entire 24-hour period asleep. De Moivre reportedly identified a specific date on which this would occur and suggested that it would likely coincide with his death. Remarkably, he died on or extremely close to the date predicted by his calculations in 1754. Historians still debate the accuracy of the story, but it remains one of history's most famous examples of someone appearing to predict their own death using mathematics. Which prediction shocked you most, and would you have ignored the warning too?